is Rashi Dembi, and I have made this presentation along with my team members, Ankur, Dave, Bala, Zachary, and Jackson. And I know you've all done your research on modern, deco, international, and some other styles, and I would just like to present our findings on the Prairie style, and I hope you find this as interesting as I do. So what is the Prairie house design? So it is a late 19th and early 20th century architectural style that was most common to the Midwestern United States. So it usually has horizontal lines, flat or hipped roofs, windows grouped in horizontal bands, integration with the landscape, solid construction, and discipline in the use of ornament. So these are some Prairie houses, and before I go on, I'm going to give you a minute to just look at them and look for some features that I just mentioned of Prairie houses. Okay, I know that wasn't a minute, but I'm going to step back in here. So two of the most significant things that are visible when we look at this picture is the flat horizontal element and the roofs, the low-pitched roofs with the overhanging eaves, and especially in this house, the flat horizontal element and the long row of windows. So these are some floor plans of Prairie houses, and what is most significant about just looking at the floor plans, although they may not seem as relevant right now, is noticing the horizontal aspect of the Prairie houses. So to help you better understand the Prairie style, I'm going to compare it with another style that you may already know a bit about, which is modern. So in the Prairie style, the doorways, so Frank Lloyd Wright's main entrances are screened for privacy, whereas in modern, there are metal or wooden doors and circular windows. There are large panels of glass, and there are patterns with circular and angular outlines. So windows. In the Prairie style, there are bands of casement windows. And remember, these windows are horizontal. There are also geometric patterns of small pane window glazing. In the modern style, there are round windows, which are made of glass block. And sometimes the windows actually turn a corner. In the Prairie style furnishings, a lot of the furniture is actually designed by Wright. So some houses are found with a wall sconce, built-in oak bookcase, ceiling light fixture, and a dining room buffet. And in modern houses, the important identifying features are distinctive streamlined or wind tunnel looks, softer rounded corners, and flat roofs, which are different from Prairie because Prairie houses have low-pitched roofs. Now I'm going to get into the history of the Prairie house. How did this movement or this style come into being? The birth of the Prairie. The creation of the Prairie style is largely credited to Frank Lloyd Wright. Through the turn of the century, Wright's personal style was evolving. His work in these years foreshadowed his so-called Prairie style. Prairie houses blend interior spaces and surrounding terrain together seamlessly. So as Wright acclaimed, the new reality that is space instead of matter. About architectural interiors, he said that a reality of a building is not the container, but the spaces within. Wright did not aspire simply to design a house, but he wanted to create an environment. Wright believed that buildings are strongly influenced by the people who inhabit them. He even said that the architect is the molder of men, whether or not he consciously assumes the responsibility. This is the first Prairie house. It's the W.W. Willets house, and it embodies all of the elements of the Prairie style. So the W.W. Willets house was built in 1902 in Illinois by Frank Lloyd Wright, and the house seamlessly blends into the surroundings and into the nature around it, as you can see. Also notice the strong horizontal aspect of the house. and the long rows of windows. Now I'm going to talk about 3 architects who have been very involved with the Prairie style. First, obviously, is Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867 in Wisconsin. His mom, Anna Lloyd Jones, was a teacher, and his dad, William Carey Wright, was a preacher and a musician. So he studied at the University of Wisconsin. Over there he studied civil engineering. However, he never actually completed his degree. He worked under Joseph Silsby, and later he worked for Adler and Sullivan. However, he was fired when he was found to be moonlighting. So he started his own firm, and he's the leader of the Prairie School movement of architecture. He's highly involved with the interiors of his buildings, creating furnishings and other custom elements such as stained glass windows to enhance the overall design. His most iconic structures include the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York and Falling Water in Pennsylvania. So to this day, he is one of the most recognized architects in the world. So his style of architecture is sometimes referred to as organic architecture. And Wright, when designing buildings, he had 3 main beliefs. First was in the romantic idea of honest expression, or that a building should reflect its materials. Second was that a building should reflect its plan. Third was that a building should represent something new and individual about the times. And he was buried in Taliesin West, Scottsdale, Arizona. So this is the W.W. Willits house, or the Ward W. Willits house. I know I talked about this before, but being the first Prairie house, it's very significant, so I'm going to talk about it a little more. So it showcased Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie style for the first time, and it was built in Highland Park, Illinois in 1902. So it had long but short roofs that extended well over the frame of the house. It had wood trimming and concrete lines to accentuate the horizontal aspects, as you can see. And he had long rows of windows covering entire walls. And again, the windows are all, I think the word is, they're emphasized horizontally. So this is the Roby House. It is one of the most famous of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs. It was built in 1908, and it is a National Historic Landmark. It is present in Hyde Park in Chicago in Illinois, and it has a low-pitched cantilevered roof with large overhanging eaves. It uses long but thin bricks to accentuate the Prairie style's focus on horizontal, as you can see all throughout here, and it has repeating art glass windows. This is the Avery Coomley House. So it was built in Riverside, Illinois, and it was completed in 1912. So the roofs, windows, and distinct horizontal lines are similar to those of previous designs, but the windows start to depart from the Prairie style because instead of being horizontally layered out, they're more layered out vertically over there. And the house blends into the environment, which, as you may have noticed, is a very common feature with Prairie school style houses. Now I'm going to talk about Percy Dwight Bentley. So he was born in La Crosse, Washington in 1885. He studied architecture at the Ohio Wesleyan University. He worked close to Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. He was an apprentice under Wells E. Bennett, and he opened his own office, and when he did so, he hired Otto A. Merman as a draftsman. However, later they became partners, and they began to design primarily Prairie-style residential houses in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and they continued to do so until Merman's death in 1935. So, Percy Dwight Bentley designed the Henry Sulzer House. So the exterior of the house is inspired by Wright's Prairie style, and this is what Mr. Sulzer wanted. The interior of the house is in the colonial residential style, as Mrs. Sulzer wanted. It has fireproof construction, which means that it is built with stucco over clay blocks. It costed $80,000, and it was initially a dark cream color with green trimmings. So these are the Chase and the Waluder bungalows. So they are mirror image houses that are located on 11th Street. They were made in 1913, and they are one-story residences. They demonstrate the airy horizontal prairie style. They have board and batten siding with stucco on top. So some of the other buildings that were designed by Bentley in the Prairie School style are the C.J. Felber House, the Emil T. Mueller House, the Daniel Macmillan House, the Frank Sisson House, the Business Building at 510 Main Street, the Richland Center City Hall, the Alois Fix House, Citizen State Bank, Guy Wakefield House, M.L. Fugina House, Gunderson Summer Cottage, and the O.E. Davis House. And as I talk about these, maybe you recognize some of them, and I hope that helps give you a better idea of the Prairie style. This house is the C.J. Felber House. And again, we can see the horizontal emphasis and this Prairie style roofing. So the third architect we're going to talk about is Barry Byrne. He was born on December 19th, 1883 in Chicago, Illinois. He was influenced by the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, and Irving Gill. He trained in Oak Park, which is actually where one of Wright's studios are. He worked with Wright's former associates, Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Mahoney. He established an office in Evanston, and in the winter of 1908 to 1909, he actually moved to Seattle, where he worked with Andrew Wolotson, and they continued to design houses together. He died in 1967. This is the James Frederick Clark House. It was built for Dr. Clark in 1916. The story behind this house is actually that Mrs. Clark wanted a colonial revival style house. However, Mr. Clark, or Dr. Clark, convinced her that the Prairie style house was a more affordable option. So this has a low-pitched gable roof and flat windows, doors, and baseboards. It is one of the first houses with attached garages. Fun fact, because Dr. James Frederick Clark was one of the first people in Jefferson County to actually own an automobile. That's how old this house is. This is the George H. Bellman House. It's located in Seattle, Washington, and it's a delicate asymmetrical house that was built on a steep bank. The composition of the planes and the location of the tree some people say that it actually compares to Japanese print. I guess it kind of looks like the characters with all of these lines. It was built and it was occupied in 1912. Thank you. So when I was doing this presentation, I found that one of the more difficult parts of it for me was the research. When I'm doing research and when my teammates were doing research, we found that when we do subjects like biology, there's so much information, we don't know what to actually include. But in architecture, when I was looking up the houses, there's barely anything. So that was the hardest part of the project for me. The easiest part of the project was definitely putting this information and organizing it into slides, because once you have the information, that's a comparatively easy thing. So what I learned from this project was so much about the Prairie style. On my own, I never would have taken the initiative to look this up. However, now, when I think about it, the Prairie school style of architecture is something that I saw when I was younger. I saw it in TV shows like Anne of Green Gables, and I always thought, wow, that looks like an old school, but now I know exactly what the design elements are and how it all comes together to create that perfect house. I hope you learned something from this presentation, and I hope that this was as interesting for you as this process actually was for me. And overall, I'd say that this was one of the best challenges I've ever had, because usually we do projects and they're long. This one was short, it was not as much work, and now I've learned so much. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.